classroom that would actually inform practice in the classroom. And so before I knew it, I ended up doing a PhD. And so my research since then has continued to focus on this domain of spelling. And I might answer some questions through my research, but it always opens up new questions as well, which I find quite exciting. So what is spelling in standard English? That's the main question that we often, sorry, I've just got someone wanting to come through. Yep. Oh, there we go. And I just noticed that I can't seem to change my slides. All right, so what is spelling in standard English? We know that standard spelling is often described as a secretarial element of writing, and sometimes it's known as a mechanical aspect or skill of the written English language. But I also love to refer to this particular definition that's described by some researchers in America, and they describe English spelling as the visible representation of word-level language using written symbols in conventional sequences, and we know this as orthography. And these conventional sequences represent speech sounds, which we know of as phonology, and they also represent word parts that signal meaning and grammar, which we know of as morphology. So learning to spell obviously is quite a complex linguistic process, and on top of that, we also know that it is etymologically complex because it does derive from diverse cultural and historical origins, particularly Latin and Greek words are coming through in our English language. And so learning to spell undoubtedly is quite a complex word formation, problem-solving process. I'd like to just illustrate this with a simple example. So in this little example, I've got a word kicked there, and you can see some green arrows as well. And I guess this example aims to show how phonology and orthography, morphology need to be integrated or cross-mapped in order to achieve accurate spelling in standard English. So these indicate these potential connections that might occur when spelling, say, the word kicked, assuming that a learner perhaps doesn't know how to spell the word automatically. That word is not committed to long-term memory. So assuming that, let's say that in order to be able to spell that word correctly, a number of processes need to occur. First, the learner might need to, in their mind, hear that word and then think about or segment all of the individual phonemes in that word. So they might hear k, I, k, as they try to write that word. But to spell that word correctly, they can't just rely on that process. They need to consider, for example, in the word kicked, there's two instances of the k phoneme. So they need to be able to think about whether to use K or CK or just C, for example. And this means that the learner who's not quite sure how to spell that word, in order to spell the word correctly, they need to be able to know that it isn't actually plausible to start a word with the letters CK, for example. It's just not a legal letter pattern in the English language. And they also need to know perhaps that KI in that sequence is plausible, but CI is not really a plausible letter pattern in the English language. But still, that's not enough. In order to spell that word correctly, if they just rely on phonological and orthographic processes, they might end up spelling kicked with a T, the letter T at the end of the word instead of ET. So in order to spell the word correctly, they also need to think about the meaning of the word and how that fits in the context of a sentence, for example, and how the word functions in a sentence, in order to be able to use ED and know that ED functions as a past tense inflected suffix. So as you can see, just with this very simple word, kicked, there are potentially multiple connections that need to be made in order to get to the correct spelling for that word. So if a person who's learning standard English spelling is explicitly taught how to coordinate these three overarching linguistic processes, their capacity to be able to coordinate these processes over time can become increasingly efficient and accurate in the presence of explicit teaching. So, in terms of spelling assessment, now the system of, or method that is used really should capture these sorts of linguistic processes that underpin the English language spelling system. But the problem is, and I'm sure that you can relate to this, is that many schools are using assessment methods that don't really provide sufficient diagnostic information. And here is just one example of that. And in this example of this particular spelling assessment, you may have observed it in some schools that you've been to. I'm not sure who my audience actually comprises, but I'm sure there are some classroom teachers or school-based educators here. And you might have seen this kind of weekly spelling test occurring in schools. So, for example, teachers might be testing students on a weekly basis, and it might be using either a random set of what they might call sight words, or they might be using a set of words that are based on a theme or a topic, which is what this example actually shows. And sometimes this may be a combination of the two, or a combination that incorporates a few words that have a linguistic property. But essentially, these kinds of tests really simply require the teacher to determine a whole word accuracy score. And this is based on a set of tests that students have, a word list that students have studied over the course of the week through a rote learning method like Books They Cover Right Check, for example. And some teachers might observe that they don't really get enough information from that kind of format of testing, and they might also observe that students don't necessarily apply that learning in other writing contexts, and certainly they may not necessarily retain whatever they've learnt with those lists of words in the longer term. So teachers, I think, can gain so many more insights about children's underlying spelling knowledge or strategy use through other methods. And that's what I'm really here to focus on today. And that is through an error analysis technique or method. Now, some assessments that are used in schools do involve an error analysis technique. And in fact, before I did my PhD, I was doing this myself, using these approaches. And in many of these sorts of instances, the form of assessment that, even though it does use an error analysis, is based around stage theories of spelling development. And stage theories of spelling development stem from research that was conducted back in the 1970s and 80s, predominantly in the US and a bit in the UK as well. And stage theories, theorists drew on a Piagetian notion of development to create a linguistic index. And this led to the categorization of spelling development into distinct sequential stages. And here are just two examples of those stage theories. Both of them are they're very similar in the sense that they both suggest that there are 5 sequential stages of spelling development. And broadly speaking, they seem to imply that children need to be able to master phonological skills before they are developmentally ready to proceed to learning orthographic, or what some researchers describe it as orthotactic knowledge. And then eventually they are developmentally ready to learn about morphology. And so from this particular perspective, this linear perspective, spelling difficulties are essentially viewed as an inability to be able to move on to the next stage. And I remember exploring this when I was teaching in school context, noticing that while I would be analysing the errors, I'd use particular spelling inventories based around these stage theories. You might be familiar with these, to categorise students into a particular stage. But I also thought that it was an overly simplistic kind of way of seeing students and confining them into a particular stage. So in terms of assessment, the idea is that really a student has to be, if you follow this approach, a student is categorized into a particular developmental stage based on your error analysis using specified inventories. However, there is a growing body of research that provides quite unequivocal evidence that learning to spell doesn't really evolve or develop in these distinct, clear, linear stages. Indeed, linear theories seem to provide a rather overly simplistic assumption of how children learn to spell, as they don't necessarily capture the range of difficulties that students encounter throughout their spelling journey. And indeed, in the last, I'd say at least decade, maybe more, alternative models have been developed through research, and I won't have time tonight to go through and critique or synthesize all of them, but I'm going to focus on this one here, triple word form theory. This is one of the non-linear models that is quite different to stage theories. And this particular theory is grounded in a range of neurocognitive and behavioural research, and it offers a non-linear perspective of how children learn to spell. And indeed, because it's based on some strong research evidence, it actually was used as a theoretical framework for my own PhD, actually. Anyway, so this theory, triple word form theory, assumes that children are capable of developing phonological, orthographic and morphological skills in parallel rather than one after the other. And according to this particular theory, these word forms are involved in learning to spell from the early years of learning to write. But changes can occur in the ways in which these three linguistic word forms interact. Importantly, this theory suggests that that learning to spell is actually heavily influenced on instructional approaches and priorities rather than natural developmental progression. And you're probably thinking, well, where's this going? But in fact, the stance that a teacher, or I should say even whole school, might take in terms of the theoretical framework that they adopt to inform the teaching of spelling can certainly influence the approach that they take in terms of actual assessment practices and also teaching. And so with this particular theory in mind, part of my PhD involved developing a spelling assessment that didn't use a stage theory approach, rather it used a nonlinear approach. And in fact, I focused on using triple word form theory as a way to inform the development of a spelling assessment tool that utilises an error analysis. And I'll take the opportunity tonight just to share a little bit of this with you now. And so this particular test is known as the components of spelling test. And it's been used in a lot of schools since I developed my PhD. It was developed originally for students in years 3 to 6. And as the triple word form theory implies, this test is structured around 3 subscales. So the phonological component or subscale, the orthographic component, and the morphological component. So it has error analysis templates that are specified around 70 words that are dictated to the students, and the students write those words. And rather than analysing the errors and then categorising a student's spelling ability into a particular developmental stage, you're just simply looking at their linguistic skills as applied to those particular words. So I'll unpack that a little bit more for you now. In the phonological component, there are 4 constructs and 31 items. So not words, but items that you analyse. And now we know that phonological knowledge encompasses several sub-skills concerned with the structure of sounds in the spoken language. And among these are syllabification and phonemic awareness. And we also know that working memory can influence phonological processing, and this can manifest itself in spelling. For example, if a child spells a word that is polysyllabic, that is a word with many syllables, it can be, as you might have observed looking at children's spelling, it can be cognitively demanding because there are, in a polysyllabic word, there are a large number of phonological constituents that may need to be held in working memory, analysed, and then sequentially encoded. So a child, you might find, can accurately spell, or apply their phonemic knowledge to encode or spell CVC words, for example, that are highly regular, phonologically regular, and they might even be able to spell consonant digraphs in one-syllable words with no issues. But what I found through my PhD in developing this test was that potential limitations in maybe phonological working memory can impede a child's capacity, potentially, to spell polysyllabic words because of the cognitive demand associated with spelling those words. So the phonological component includes items that are designed really to check if a child can spell initial and final consonant phonemes that are represented by one letter, and also words that have a short vowel phoneme represented by one letter, and also consonant digraphs in one-syllable words. But it takes it a little step further because we're talking about older students here. And I've included a construct in this test that looks at how well or how accurately a student can encode the middle parts of a polysyllabic word that are that do have a one-to-one sound-to-letter correspondence, and so it's very phonetic in that sense. And in the middle parts of those words, I've got a little example to show you what I mean. So one of the words is substantial. I might give you a moment to, you can see this word right here now, but if you have a go at imagining that you're a child and you don't really know that word very well, perhaps it's not a word you use very often in your writing, and you want to write the word. And as you do, and as you apply your phonological skills, you might sound out the word. And a large portion of that word can be sounded out. If you think S is S, is U, B is B, S is S, T is T, A is A, N is N, and then the rest of it is morphologically complex. But a large part of that word is, you can sound it out and have a good crack at it. But if you look at this example that a child has written, there's a breakdown in phonological processing. So because there are so many phonological constituents in that word, some phonemes might be misrepresented, so they might be substituted with a different letter sound correspondence, or you might see some omissions as well. In this example, there's no T and there's no N. And so that's an example that really sort of differentiates, I guess, those students who, have very good phonological skills that they can apply to polysyllabic words, as opposed to students who, they might have knowledge of their letters and sounds and phonics knowledge, but the question is, can they apply that knowledge to polysyllabic words, words that have, or parts of those polysyllabic words that are phonologically regular. Anyway, so in the orthographic component of the test, there are 5 constructs and there are 29 individual items. So orthographic awareness requires sensitivity to letter patterns or sequences, and also the orthographic positional constraints within words. Researchers have described this also as orthotactic knowledge. Rebecca Tryman, I think, has referred to this in some of her research. And so the orthographic aspects of spelling are concerned with certain sublexical conventions that are specific to a particular written language, in this case in English. So orthographic knowledge entails knowing the typical arrangements or sequences or sequencing of letter groups within words, and how the spelling of some phonemes are context sensitive. So for example, the letter sequence OU to represent the ow diphthong. The OU letters or I guess you can call it digraph, for the our diphthong, rarely appears in the final position of a word in standard English, where the corresponding phoneme is pronounced as ow, like in the word cow. You wouldn't write it as C-O-U. It would be C-O-W instead. So a student may know that the ow diphthong can be spelled in various ways, but a student who has heightened orthographic sensitivity or knowledge will know, maybe instinctively or maybe because they've explicitly been taught that, they'll know whether it's more likely that they should use OW as opposed to OU as an example. So many children, it's understood that, or thought, I guess, that many children can pick up some information about these sorts of orthographic or context-sensitive patterns in our English language through simply exposure to print over time. If you think about it, you know, how did you know some of these things and come to learn it? Was it explicitly taught to you, or just through your exposure to print, you've just come to know that, you know, a word in English would never start with CK. It just doesn't look, it wouldn't be plausible to do that. So yes, some of that can be developed, you know, through osmosis, exposure to print. However, a lot of this can be learned more quickly. We can speed up the pace of this learning if we explicitly teach some of these orthotactic or orthographic skills to students. And I think that's what often is missing in some aspects of instruction, is looking at how certain phonemes are context sensitive, and that will determine what letter choices to make. Here's one little example. In the word bottle, there are two orthographic features that the components of spelling test looks at for this particular word. The first one is the syllable juncture consonants. So in the word bottle, it should have two T's. Now, a student might apply their phonological skills and know that t needs a T, but the question is, do they know when to double it or not? And that would depend on what phoneme comes before that phoneme in the word bottle at the juncture between the two syllables. So whether to double or not to double is an aspect of orthographic knowledge that the components of spelling test tries to kind of tease out a little bit. And the other aspect is the final unaccented syllable in this word. Now, when I say the word bottle, the last phoneme I hear is ul, but obviously in this case, the student has correctly used LE to represent the final unaccented syllable. And these often have a schwa in them, which complicates things when it comes to spelling. And there's lots of schwas in our English language. So does the student know that in this word, because of its position, the likely letter sequence is not EL or UL, it's actually LE. Unfortunately, there's no rule that we can teach to say why it's LE and for that word, but it is, and so that's why a lot of students find this quite tricky, just because it's an unusual kind of letter pattern to learn. But in instances like this, children can learn that some words, you know, if you just sound it out, you might end up using something odd like EL, which would be wrong orthographically. But making analogies with other words can help in these sorts of instances. Words like bottle, little, people, ripple, there's lots of words that end in LE that have the same sound in that position, an unaccented final syllable. And so that would be the way you teach it. So an assessment tool that kind of captures this, gives you a sense of whether students are getting that or not, can help you to decide as a teacher whether that's something you need to teach students. Moving on to the morphological component of this particular test, another aspect of spelling that we can't ignore. And so morphological knowledge is important in standard English spelling, and it involves knowing the meaning of morphemes, which are the small meaningful units in words. And this includes prefixes, suffixes, base words, and even the alterations in meaning and grammatical class that these prefixes and suffixes bring to base words and roots. But it goes beyond that. It also, as Apel talks about, it involves knowing the manner in which written affixes, so prefixes or suffixes, connect to base words or roots, including any changes that need to be made to the base word or root. And there are lots of regularities or rules that we can teach children around this. So that's another aspect of spelling that we need to be able to find ways to assess to help teachers identify, what types of morphological skills a student still needs to be explicitly taught. Here's a little example. An inflected suffix, the ing at the end of the word shopping. A student might know that, yes, it needs ing at the end of the word, but that's only, part of the information. So we also want an assessment really that tells us whether the student knows how to treat the base word when the suffix is added. And in this example, the student obviously hasn't doubled the P. So there's a clear example of how, with that insight and knowing that, the teacher can then go ahead to explicitly teach the doubling rule for words like that. And so actually, there's quite a lot of research emerging more recently that suggests that morphological skills can be introduced quite early. So if you think about it, if you're teaching through a phonics program quite explicitly and systematically, and students can write words like pan, pin, tin, tap, they may not know they might not have mastered their phonics skills entirely, but they might know enough to then start to be able to know that S can have a special function, a purpose, and work as, for instance, in this example here, as a plural marking suffix. And so you don't have to wait necessarily until students have completely mastered all of their phonics skills before you start introducing some basic morphology. And indeed, the Australian curriculum does, acknowledge that there are opportunities in the early years for some basic aspects of morphology to be introduced and explicitly taught in the curriculum. Just to sort of put it out there, so like I said, the components of spelling test was, as a real word test, was developed as part of my PhD. And this just shows that, that the actual test itself has some scale reliability results using Cronbach's alpha to provide some evidence of strong internal consistency across the 3 subscales based on a sample of data from Year 3 and Year 5 students. And also, this comes from my PhD, this particular test, using another sample of data where I looked to see whether the components of spelling test, which is a dictation test, whether performance in that test correlates with performance in NAPLAN spelling, which is more of a proofreading and editing style of spelling test. And this study here provides evidence that there is a strong correlation between the 2 test types. What I might add too is, which is quite interesting, is that even though all 3 components had strong correlations with NAPLAN spelling, the orthographic component seemed to have a stronger correlation than phonology and morphology. And I'm not really surprised with this, because if you think about NAPLAN's spelling format, the format there really requires students to be able to identify whether a word looks right or wrong in a sentence. So identify which word is incorrectly spelled, and then work out which part of the word is incorrectly spelled, which really potentially might tap into orthographic skills, and then correct it. So while the correlation is there between all 3 subscales, the correlation was strongest in the orthographic component of the test. So anyway, so this particular finding provides some evidence of predictive validity. So I guess the point is that teachers, if they're going to be using some kind of, any kind of assessment really, it's important for them to be aware of any reliability and validity testing that has been conducted on that test, because it gives them a little bit more certainty or assurance as to, how accurately that assessment is tapping into a student's particular skills.
My name is Jill Steddall. I'm the manager Manager of Speech Pathology at the Royal Children's Hospital, and I'd like to welcome you all to our event for tonight, which is talking about cleft lip and palate. So I'll just start by doing the acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on
I'm not sure what that is.
The Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the support from University of Melbourne, who are providing the Zoom facilities tonight, and Dr. Ruth Nicol, who's the Allied Health Clinical Education Lead, who's supporting us behind the scenes with all the Zoom technical aspects. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we start, just regarding questions.
Sorry about this, everyone. We'll just wait
hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Because it's a webinar, we will be using the chat function in Zoom, which is a speech bubble down the bottom.
I've just muted someone, and I think that's fixed the problem.
Right, I couldn't find them. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. I think maybe there's some other presentation happening concurrently. Okay,
Right.
the problem is resolved. So where was I? So the test developed as part of my PhD for years 3 to 6 students, ideally, was a base test. And since then, I have developed an online version of that particular test for 2 reasons. One, to save time for teachers who often say, you know, while they find an error analysis technique of assessment to be very useful, it can be very time consuming. And for me too, as a researcher, when I'm analysing large cohorts of data in this way, it is very time intensive. So an online platform was my next project that I really wanted to embark on. And so this online test for students in years 3 to 6 works in the same way as the paper-based test. The teachers rather than handwriting the words, they log in and then they type the words, and then the errors are automatically analysed. And so then the teacher receives a spreadsheet that has all of the results for them ready to go. It's quite an instant process. And then they can do what they like with it, really. So in the manual that I have that accompanies it, there are some norms that were derived from my PhD. And so teachers they receive the raw score results like I showed you before for each of the 3 components, and then they can cross-check the raw scores with normed data, which are based on a broadly representative sample of Australian students. And so this kind of assessment can inform teachers and whole schools, especially whole schools, to monitor progress over time. And in addition to the raw scores, the online platform provides a colour-coded summary with instructional recommendations that accompany the manual. And so across the top row, you see P1, P2, P3, P4, and they basically refer to specific linguistic skills. And the colours that you see relate to the scores from the error analysis that the computer automatically generates. So green basically means that they've got all the items correct, so they're demonstrating that skill based on that test. The amber colour refers to the fact that they might have had some of the items correct but not all, so they're starting to demonstrate a particular skill. And the red or pink colour indicates that they're way off, they haven't demonstrated that skill sufficiently. So this kind of class summary has helped the teachers that I've worked with in schools since my PhD to then work out how they can provide small group targeted instruction using assessment data. And just as a little example here, for the morphological code, so M1 refers to inflected suffixes, M2 refers to derivational suffixes, and so on. And then the manual has examples of the kinds of things that teachers might do. There's some photocopy templates that can be photocopied. It's not a complete program in its own right. It's certainly not intended to be that way. And in fact, the teachers that I've worked with in the past that have used this are encouraged to use this in conjunction with other resources that they might have available. But essentially the most important thing is that they're not just randomly picking activities to do. the activities that they're actually asking the children to engage with, and the teaching that happens that should be explicit, should be based on the needs of the students, based on some kind of systematic analysis of spelling errors. I'd like to share with you a little example of a study that I conducted, I think it was not last year, but the year before, and I haven't published the full findings of the study yet, but I'll share a few little snapshots with you now. So it was an intervention study that involved 4 schools, and I used a stratified random sampling technique to select 4 primary schools, and they were in Canberra, which is where I was based at the time. I'm now in Wollongong. And the schools were randomly selected using the stratified sample. So I had in the intervention group and in the comparison group, I had a low ICSIA school and a high ICSIA school in both of those groups. And they were randomly selected to participate, and then they were randomly assigned to either the intervention or the comparison groups. So the comparison groups had to follow a business as usual approach, and this is based on self-reported data from the teachers as part of a survey. So that report revealed that teachers generally were, the business as usual approach generally was a combination of incidental phonics, a bit of like rote learning of word lists through, say, cover right check methods, with a combination of, you know, like I said, a bit of themed topic words as well thrown into the mix. Some teachers said that they would also incorporate a little bit of morphology, but it was quite an incidental ad hoc sort of approach. Some teachers said that they didn't explicitly teach spelling at all. So that was business as usual. The intervention group, so the 2 schools involved in the intervention, were given the assessment data based on the error analysis, so the computer-generated error analysis, and the colour coding. And using the colour-coded class summary, I worked with the teachers, so there was a lot of professional development before the intervention started and then during the intervention, which actually was very important because I also collected some linguistic information about the teachers to understand what their needs were, and that was very revealing that their linguistic knowledge was quite low, and so I needed to ensure that the teachers had that linguistic knowledge so that they knew how to explicitly teach, and also how they needed to know how to use the data to inform their teaching and their planning. So they developed a program that worked for them. There needed to be some flexibility for them, otherwise there would be no buy-in really, but within certain parameters. So the structure looked a little bit like this. Based on the colour coding, they had, rather than having generic spelling groups like a low, middle and high sort of kind of configuration, I asked them to look at the phonological data first and then group students according to that. Then look at the orthographic data and group students according to that, and then group students according to their morphological skills. So the grouping configurations varied, and they certainly were not static over time. The intervention was 10 weeks, by the way. So the structure that I encouraged them to follow was something like this. I want to ensure that you spend, so these are students in years 3 to 6, at least one day with explicit phonological instruction, then a day on orthography or a session on orthography, then morphology, and then another session that brings it all together and provides an opportunity for further consolidation or extension or, you know, to apply or integrate those 3 word forms together. And within each of those days, there was an idea of, you know, using that, removing the responsibility from the teacher to the student. So it was, you know, very teacher directed through to, you know, letting the children explore and the teacher monitoring and then demonstrating some independent skills throughout that. So the small group configurations happened on each day, and And the small grouping configurations then allowed the teacher to monitor student progress and to provide very targeted, explicit teaching. The sessions didn't need to be long. They were, 15 to 20 minutes of very focused and intensive instruction. And that explicit instruction that I asked the teachers to ensure that they were following included some of these features. I wanted them to first decide on the learning intentions and the success criteria and ensure that those were made transparent to the students. The teachers then needed to incorporate some very explicit explanations and modelling of a particular new strategy or a rule or a generalisation to do with spelling. And in doing so, they needed to use meta-language to explicitly teach. And part of that cycle each day included checking for understanding, making sure that the students were able, for example, to articulate a strategy that was explicitly taught, or also it might have involved the teacher looking and analysing students' writing to see whether they have accurately, demonstrated a particular skill that's been taught. So the idea was that the teachers had to try and teach spelling explicitly at least 3 times a week, but preferably 4 times a week. I thought that was quite a realistic aim to achieve in a real school context where there's so many things happening all the time. And I'll just re-emphasise that this study, hasn't been fully published yet. I'm still preparing the findings, the article to submit to a peer-reviewed journal. And one of the things that I asked the teachers to do, and this helps with fidelity as well, but also it helps them, was to document, not all the time, but certainly in the first part of the study, the phase of the intervention, I wanted to see how they were grouping the students and how they were using the assessment data to inform what they were going to teach. So I gave them some, lesson planning templates that looked a little bit like this to get them to just dot points, a few little points so that I could see, and so they could, make it quite explicit to themselves what they were teaching and why they were teaching it, which is very important. Here's a little snapshot of what I found. In the intervention group, there were 14 classes, and in that 10-week period between time 1 and time 2, all classes made statistically significant gains, which is really exciting. And I was hoping that actually the comparison group classes would make gains as well. This is what I found. Well, one class made a statistically significant gain, but all the other classes didn't make statistically significant gains in that time period. They were making little gains, but they weren't statistically significant. And some of them didn't make any gain at all. Their score didn't change. And some actually went a little bit backwards, which is a little bit concerning. And like I said, I haven't submitted this in a peer-reviewed journal, but it's just a little insight. And one of the key, I think, messages that I learnt from this intervention study was that it really highlights the importance of allowing teachers or providing opportunities for teachers to know how to use assessment data to inform teaching priorities. So, some teachers, yes, they might be explicitly teaching spelling, but the question is, are they explicitly teaching what needs to be taught, where the gaps are? And perhaps that might be one of the key differences. And the other thing too is, and the work of the research of Graham and Santangelo highlights that if we increase the amount of explicit teaching, the likelihood is that the gains will be bigger, that the gains in performance will be larger and sustained over time. So encouraging teachers to not only use explicit teaching methods, but making sure it is informed by assessment data, and also ensuring that that it is relevant to the students through that data. So otherwise it's kind of a waste of time for everyone. Now you might be wondering, well, that's a real word spelling test. And yes, it's a real word spelling test that I developed as part of my PhD. And like any assessment will have limitations. And that's why teachers really should be triangulating their assessment practices, using different forms of assessment to get a full profile of a student's skill in whatever it is, not the spelling. And this always did play on my mind that, well, in fact, in my PhD, I found that students, say, for example, in Year 6, that were good spellers, achieving high grades in NAPLAN, for instance, in Year 5 as well, were reaching ceiling in some of the, like in the orthographic component of the spelling test. And that could be because perhaps it is a real word measure of spelling ability, and the fact that it is based on real words could potentially mean that we're overestimating a student's capacity or performance in spelling because of the potential influences in prior word-specific knowledge. And so with this in mind, my next project, as soon as I finished my PhD, the first research project I was really keen to embark on was to have a go at developing components of spelling tests, but using pseudo-words. And if you're interested in finding out more about this particular test, I don't have time to really go into the details about all the validity and reliability findings that I went through, but it is published in this journal here. And that share link, I'm hoping, still works, and you might be able to access that article if you're interested. If not, and you are really keen to read the article, you can always let me know and I can provide that article for you, I'm sure. So I'll share a little bit of a snapshot of that particular the pseudo-word test so that you have a sense of what it does. And it works in the same way as the real word test in the sense that it has 3 components and it's informed by triple word form theory. In the phonological component, there are 3 constructs. There's a monosyllabic construct, a disyllabic construct, and a polysyllabic construct. There's actually a version for Years 3 and 4 and a version of the test for students in Years 5 and 6. So in this particular test, the pseudo-word test has words that have in the phonological component that are phonologically regular. They have a 1-to-1 sound-to-letter correspondence. So every phoneme has a single letter correspondence, and there's no alternative plausible spelling for those sorts of words. So I've got just some examples here. There's only one for each construct. So for monosyllabic words, I might say the word bemp. And the students need to look closely as well at my mouth and hear the word carefully to be able to then encode that word. The disyllabic words are the same, but they're 2 syllables. So they're essentially like an onset rhyme pattern in each syllable. So flub-spong, flub-spong. And then polysyllabic words in this test, they're all 3-syllable words, and they work in the same way. Yostingflish, yostingflish. They're just some examples. And so a bit like in the real word test, I noticed that students were performing generally, they knew their letters and sounds and they could apply them, their phonic knowledge, to monosyllabic words, but they really fell back on disyllabic and especially polysyllabic words. And this is what really is revealing that, you know, we may overestimate a child's spelling skills because we think that they know they have their phonic skills, but they're not necessarily applying that to more, you know, to longer words. And because that is related to their phonological working memory skills, that might be, you know, limiting their capacity to be able to, you know, retain these non-words into their short-term memory and then encode them accurately. And students, as they get older, get better at doing this. And the work of Susan Gathercole, who has done a lot of research in the field of working memory and executive functioning and all of those sorts of skills, has found similar findings that phonological working memory is something that can really impact on performance skills. And as students get older with age, their working memory capacity does improve. And so we can help children, I guess, break down those cognitive demands with words like that by encouraging, for example, one strategy might be, you know, try to break up the word into syllables to reduce the cognitive load, and then in each syllable slowly work through, you know, sounding out those words, segmenting and blending those words at the syllable level, just to help reduce the cognitive load. Anyway, the orthographic component of the test, the phonological component of the test also has an opportunity for teachers to do some further analysis, looking at whether if there is a spelling error, say in the word tid, if they misspell the word, is it that there's an epenthesis, which is where they add the spelling results in the addition of an extra phoneme in the word, or if there's a spelling error, is that because there's an omission, so the spelling results in the omission of a phoneme? Or if there's a spelling error, does the spelling result in the substitution of a particular phoneme? And that provides further insight into the kinds of phonological errors that might be happening in some of these words that are incorrectly spelled. The orthographic component has two parts. The first part looks at those constrained or context-sensitive positions. So, for example, I mentioned this earlier, the ow diphthong. Does the student know whether it's OU or OW? So the student has to write the word, in this case, the example is trounced. Now, in this part of the test, I'm not really worried about looking at the TR and the NT part. I'm just simply looking at the vowel, the diphthong, and how they represent it. Does the student know that it's OU as opposed to OW? And so the scores are dichotomous. It's either right or it's wrong. So part A has those kinds of items in there. Part B focuses just on common long vowel patterns in words where there are multiple ways to spell those words. And this was an interesting one to develop. So essentially, in this example, I would say to the student, the pseudo word is late. And as you can see, there's different ways I could plausibly spell that word. I simply want to know whether the student can use any of those, one of those plausible graphemes to represent that particular vowel phoneme. So part B focuses on those sorts of spelling patterns. Then in the morphological component, it's quite different because it's about morphemes. You can't present these out of context. So the words or the pseudo words are presented in a sort of like a cloze exercise that is also dictated. So in the construct that I have for inflected suffixes, here is one example. So the child sees the sentence or sentences, and the word that they have to write is blank. So they have to write the missing word, but the person, the teacher who administers the test, has to say that missing word as well, so they hear it. So imagine I'm assessing a child. This is what the child sees. They see this sentence, I will vipe, and then they also see you are, and then there's a blank line. And the base word vipe is in bold. So the child sees and hears, I will vipe, you are viping. So the child has to write viping, and the template that is used to analyse it looks to see whether the child not only knows to add ing, but also looks to see whether they know to drop the E in this instance before adding the ing. Here's an example of a derivational suffix item. So the base word is actually a verb in this context, and the child has to write an abstract noun. So I will don fat the table, and then there's a blank space, and I say don faction will make the table strong. So they have to write the whole word, but I'm not concerned about, whether or not they're writing the first part right. I mean, they've got a clue there to help them. What I'm interested in is, first of all, do they know to use ION? But also, do they know that because the base verb ends in a T, I have to keep that T there and then add ION. And these rules there are rules, and we can explicitly teach these to students. An example of a prefix. So obviously, as you can see, each pseudo word has a real morpheme component to it, so a real suffix or a real prefix. So this one's looking at the re prefix. The opposite of regular is irregular. So this is actually an example of an assimilated prefix where the actual prefix is in, which refers to the opposite, so not. And if the student knows how to assimilate a prefix that is in to a base word, then they will know the rule is drop the final consonant of the prefix, which is N, and replace it with the first letter of the base word. Now, most students don't know this. Even the high achieving spellers in Year 6 are not necessarily getting these correct. And it's probably because they have never been explicitly taught this rule. And it's really quite a simple rule to teach and can be applied to other assimilated prefixes. So there are items like that in this pseudo word test. And then there are some items that look at Greek and Latin roots. These are not presented as closed tasks. They just simply have to write the target word. And I'm just looking at the target morpheme, which is the root. In this case, in this example, it's aqua. So I give them a clue by saying something to do with aqua. So they have a bit of a clue. The aquabost ran out of water. Spell aquabost or write aquabost. And I just want to know that they know how to write aqua. So there's some items like that in this test as well. I had lots of fun developing these items, by the way. Anyway, so the teachers can then, use the norms that I've got available for the pseudo word test to just check to see how students are going, gauge their performance, their relative performance, I guess, and it can be helpful to track progress over time. I haven't had a huge uptake of the pseudo word test, partly because I haven't actually released it formally yet. I'm going to be releasing it soon in the next edition of the Components of Spelling manual that I've got. But I have given it out to teachers to trial and use. And it can be helpful for students or classes where a teacher says, I've got a group of really good spellers in this class, and some of them, they're getting full marks in the real word test. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's because they just know those words. So let's investigate further, and maybe this pseudo word test might help you to know how you can really extend some of these high achieving spellers. I think a pseudo word test can also be really helpful for students who are not making gains, because maybe somehow they have come to learn the set of words that you're testing them on, and so they just know how to spell those words, and you're not really getting a pure or accurate understanding of the underlying strategies or skills that a student can and can't use or demonstrate. And so a pseudo word test, I think, can really help in those instances where you just need a little more assurance as to exactly what might be going on with a particular child. I have continued to develop new tests over the years, and most recently is one for the early years, which hasn't been released yet, but I am actually using it with a large group of schools who are using it as part of a professional learning project with the New South Wales Department of Education. So thanks to them for supporting this. And so I've got, I think, nearly 80 schools involved in this, and they will be using this test. So this early years version of the test for the moment is just based on real words, but I'm sure that my next project will be to develop one using pseudo words. So this is actually quite a comprehensive test. It's got lots of words that the students have to write, and so lots of items to analyse. And because it is so large, you're looking at more fine-grained aspects of spelling in the early years. It needs to be quite comprehensive if you really want to get a true understanding of what students can and can't do. But because it's so large, obviously children can't sit the test all in one hit. It's just not fair for them, and it's just not realistic. So my recommendation is for children and teachers to administer each component on separate occasions, and maybe even not necessarily all 3 components. They could pick and choose which of the 3 they might want to do. So that's what my project is I'm working on this at the moment. And because it's such a large test, and I know that teachers will not want to engage with it if they have to manually analyse every single error, like you see here, that would just take them a very long time for every student in every class. It just is not feasible. So there is an online version that I've developed as well that teachers can use. And so this is a little bit in a way like the pseudo-word test, because it does have the capacity to look at errors in terms of whether there's an epenthesis, an elision or a substitution. And the yellow highlights that you see indicate that the word is correct, and when it's not highlighted, it means that it's, there's an error. And the red dots indicate that there is evidence of either an epenthesis or an elision or a substitution. So I hope to have this, the full manual for this with all the instructional recommendations available early next year, but that's not quite ready yet to be released. But I'm very excited about the project and working with so many wonderful teachers. So the error analysis that is automated looks a little bit like this. So the students enter, like the real word version, the students type in their ID, they select the test, the component test that they want to do, they type their words. In the early years, I would recommend probably an iPad might be best. And then the analysis is automated, and then there are codes that can be used for, to help teachers work out, where the strengths and weaknesses are. That template that has the coding at the bottom, P1, P2, P3, P4, all the colour coding that you see can be used and adapted, I think, for looking at children's writing samples as well. So this is just a dictation test, the words are specified, but a teacher should also look at the kinds of errors that children might be making in their everyday writing, because this is really important to see how they're applying their skills in other contexts. And this can be through a qualitative kind of approach and a quick colour coding sort of approach, just to monitor progress and see how it's applied in a more qualitative way. So this form of assessment can be adapted so that it is not just a dictation kind of test, but then as it's applied to children's writing. So basically, to finish up, I might just make a few final remarks about spelling assessment in general. And I strongly believe, and I know I'm not the only person who has done research in this field who believes this, spelling error analysis that does, or a spelling assessment that does utilise an error analysis provides potentially so many rich insights into children's strategy use. And this can really help then teachers to explicitly teach the targeted phonological, orthographic and morphological aspects of spelling that need to be taught. And that will then help children to develop accurate and efficient uses of these particular strategies when they're spelling. But like I said, an error analysis of some kind that is manual takes time, and teachers need to know how to do it. So they do need to be well supported in that process through professional development. They need to know things that we might just assume teachers might know, but they don't necessarily. The difference between a consonant blend and a consonant digraph, and what is an inflected suffix and what is a derivational suffix, and what are some of the rules that I need to look out for. Teachers need to know these things so that if they are going to engage in error analysis, they are doing it accurately and as efficiently as possible. So any form of assessment that is informing teaching priorities is going to yield better results, undoubtedly, with children's spelling performance. And on that note, I think I might end and open it up to some questions that people might have, or observations as well. I'd be interested to hear on what you've observed in terms of assessment practices.
Well, before we get to any questions, Tessa, thank you so much. That was fascinating and some wonderful resources there for people to delve into. So thanks so much for that. I have recorded tonight's session, so with your permission, I will be putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming days for anyone who wants to go back over any of those elements that they may have missed, or to recommend to other people. So I just think that was quite amazing. So thank you so much. We've got no questions.
Oh, okay.
It's the first time ever. Martha's just said that was awesome. Thank you. And I agree, Martha.
I do have a quick question, if that's all right.
Yes.
No worries.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm actually just wondering how I could access that pseudo-word version of the cost. We have the cost at our school at the moment, and I'm also keen to know when that early years might be released.
So the pseudo-word test, I will be putting it in the second edition of the manual, but I can send you a PDF of it if you like. So
that would be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
And you've got my email address, so here.
I do, and I will email you too, because I have some questions about being able to access that online tool as well. So I might email you about that if that's okay.
Yeah, that's not a problem. So I should say, I didn't say this actually. So the online version is a separate thing to the manual, obviously itself. Because I need access to student names to be able to give them an ID for it. And the early years one, I'm just finalising the, final stages of it. So I hope to have it released either at the end of this year, but probably early next year.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for tonight. That was wonderful.
No worries. It's my pleasure.
I think we've got one question there before we leave, but also a great comment from Rosemary Hughes. And in a nice way, I think she's written, "We are all mind-boggled." And I think that's, in a nice way, Tessa, summing up such a high level and such an incredible presentation tonight. So thanks so much for that. But the question from Sheridan Foster was, can this be used by parents, in particular the online version, given they are using it with one child?
Yeah, I think if I think it's great to get parents to use the online version, as long as they don't teach the words to the children, because that would invalidate the results. And that's, I guess, one of the concerns I have is, in a way, parents need a bit of information. They need a bit of professional learning if they're going to engage with something like this, because if they're going to do the online version, they just simply need to know that they can't give any clues. They can't emphasize a particular phoneme, as they're dictating the words. They can't get the children to practice the words first before doing the test. We might take that for granted, but there might be some teachers parents who might do things like that, and that would completely invalidate the results. But, otherwise, the fact that it is all automated would mean that parents don't need to worry about knowing everything. But at the same time, once they get that data, then what will they do with it? How will they know where to next? And, I know some parents might take it to their classroom teacher and say, look, this is what I did. And the reality is that some teachers might look at that and be quite resistant to that. They might sort of think that, well, I'm not going to believe that, or, sadly, sometimes it can happen. And that would be quite devastating for parents. So I think there'd need to be some really rich conversations and thoughtful discussions between parents and teachers, so that the parents are well supported if they present this information to the teachers. I do have a YouTube channel with some videos of me they're not professionally produced videos by any means, they're just really from my phone. But they can also be used by parents and teachers to get some ideas as well. It doesn't have all the answers. It's certainly not comprehensive, but there's some ideas there that some teachers and parents can take away by looking at those videos.
Torben has asked, what is the cost of the online assessment if it is separate from the manual?
For the 3 to 6 one, it's $55 per class.
Okay.
That's a couple of dollars per student, really.
And I think the last question, Diane Lewis says, I'm a first year teacher. What resources would you recommend to ensure I'm teaching spelling rules accurately? Can you answer that in under a minute, Tessa?
Yeah. Well, the manual does have a lot of rules, but I've actually already got a book that's underway. That's a little spelling compendium of rules, and that's going to be released early next year as well. It's going to be a little book with rules, because I know teachers have asked me that question, lots of teachers, you know, is there a little book that I can just quickly look up and find those rules? So I am actually developing that too.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time tonight, Tessa. That was a lot to take in, and it shows all of the work that you've been putting in over the last few years, but it was fantastic. So we'll be on our YouTube channel shortly. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Next week, we do have a repeat. We're like a TV channel. We do repeats from time to time. It's David Morkunis, who unfortunately couldn't present to most people who signed up due to a Zoom error. Back in May, I think we had 400 plus people, and only 100 were able to sign up. So Dave will be talking about interleaving and space practice from a classroom teacher's perspective at Bentley West. So we are repeating that next week, and David will also be on board to answer some questions. So look forward to that next week. Thanks again, Tessa. Really appreciate it, and we'll see everyone next week. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. See you. Bye.